So DC Comics has a problem, and I think I've come up with exactly what that one singular problem that's keeping them from reaching success here in the modern era of comics is, and we're going to talk about that. But first, I have to give a little trigger warning. My idea might upset a few of you out there, especially fans of a certain comic book writer, but this is just my opinion, and I think it's a good one, and I'd like to hear you guys' feedback on it, but let's continue. So DC Comics has had trouble righting its ship here in the modern comic book era, and they keep getting themselves into these corners, which forces them to resort to reboot after reboot after reboot after partial reboot, and now we've got another reboot on the horizon with Dawn of the DCU coming January 2023. And unfortunately, because I see from their marketing that they're going to be bringing this problematic storytelling device with them that they keep clinging onto like an anchor that's dragging them to the murky depths of the ocean floor into this new universe, which makes me think this reboot's going to be nothing but an unsuccessful attempt to get their universe going for another 5 to 10 years until the next reboot comes along. So now DC Comics' problem isn't its characters. It's not its legacy characters. It's not the current creative staffs that are working on the books, and it's not the current political climate in the studio, although let's face it, all of that stuff is contributing to the problem. But no, that is not the thing that's holding DC back and keeping them from finding success. DC Comics' problem is its multiverse. It needs to ditch this idea quickly, and we're going to go into why. So the DC Comics multiverse is this idea of multiple Earths with multiple versions of its characters all inhabiting these Earths. Sometimes it's infinite, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's 52 Earths, sometimes it's fewer, sometimes it's more. But there's always the idea of the multiverse, and this infinite avenue of ideas has led to the final evolutionary stage of the idea of the multiverse, and that is the omniverse, which is this stupid idea that anything that can happen within DC does happen, and everything is happening and not happening all simultaneously. And according to the last editorial notes given to readers, basically DC continuity is whatever the reader decides is continuity. So you can have the Justice League dead in one book, alive in another book. Batman can be sidelined in one book, perfectly fine in another book. Superman's off on another planet in one book, but he's talking to inner city youths in another book. So it's all nonsense. Nothing makes any sense. There's no rules to any of this. And when you have no rules, you have no stakes, which means your books don't matter and your stories don't matter. And that's the rut that DC finds themselves in going into this new reboot, this new universe, new incarnation of itself. And let's look at the multiverse as a whole. So the multiverse wasn't some brilliant storytelling idea that somebody came up with to create this rich, dynamic world. It was more just kind of a way to kind of wave your hand to get rid of some editorial issues it had back in the day. Because back in the golden age of comics, DC Comics was just one imprint that bought a bunch of existing comic book IPs and put them together. So you had all these characters that many of them had their own established universes before they became DC Comics. And so the easy way to handle it is, okay, well, each character is their own world. So Batman and Robin are the only superheroes in their world, and Superman's the only superhero in his world, and Wonder Woman's the only superhero in her world, Green Lantern's the only superhero in his world, and so on and so forth. But the problem was a lot of their fans wanted to see their comic characters, these characters interact. They wanted to see what happened if Batman and Superman had an adventure together and what that would look like. So the way they came at that problem, since Batman is on his world and Superman is on his world, it was to say, okay, well, there's a third world where Gotham City and Metropolis both exist on one planet, and Superman and Batman can meet up on that world, and they could have adventures. And that kind of made sense for that. I mean, it was clunky, but it did its job. It put the characters together. But unfortunately, this storytelling device got abused so many times by writers that would use it to tell stories or introduce characters that shouldn't be canon. So you would end up having Batman as the Cape Crusader with Robin in one world fighting crime, but in another world he's married to Catwoman and they have a daughter who's the Huntress. And one issue of Batman took place in that world, but then the next issue took place in the other world that's just him and Robin. And Superman and Superboy are taking place on alternate Earths. So Superman's present is on one Earth and his past is on another. And you see how this is getting confusing. If somebody read every single DC comic every single month for years, they'd probably be able to keep track of all this. But if you were somebody who was brand new to DC Comics, you just picked up a random book, enjoyed it, and then tried to pick up another one that now all of of a sudden takes place on a different Earth, you see why this doesn't make sense. And this really came into play around the 70s when Marvel Comics came along and really just started eating DC's lunch in the sales department, because they had this universe that felt neat and vibrant and lived in. And a good reason for that was because pretty much all the Marvel comic book heroes are not only on the same Earth, they live in the same city. I mean, they were just all in New York. So you would have these bits of interconnective tissue where Peter Parker might get a photography assignment going to Tony Stark to photograph his latest invention, or the Avengers and Fantastic Four could team up, and it was really easy to do because they were already there. You didn't have to go through these cosmic gymnastics to get them on the page together. So DC Comics came up with a solution to this, and that was the Crisis on Infinite Earths, where they did away with their multiverse. And they destroyed all the other Earths. They created one prime world where all the heroes that were going to survive lived. And that prime universe had one shared history, a timeline that literally started from the beginning of time and went to the modern era. And this is really where DC found its strength. This is where a lot of DC's best stuff comes from. And yeah, there's a lot of people who have a soft spot for DC's golden age, and there was a lot of good stuff in there. But for the most part, it was really convoluted and confusing. If you try to read it as a whole, as a fan, if you were just keeping up with Flash, that's one thing, but even that was really confusing. Whereas in the newer era of the DC Comics, everything was cohesive, everything came together, and they had this universe that literally had a history starting with the beginning of the universe, which was created by some of the best creators that ever worked in comics. And, George Perez, Marv Wolfman, all these guys created this beginning of the DC universe. And then Neil Gaiman came along and did the Books of Magic and did the same thing for the mystical side of the DC universe. So not only did you have this world with history, but you understood how things worked and why it worked, and these mechanics that held the universe together, and it made it feel real and lived in, and people could invest in it. And it was awesome. It was great. And it led to this era of DC Comics that was just brilliant storytelling, where you would have actual stakes in your comics. When Superman died in his comic, it's not like you could go over to the pages of Justice League and he's still there. You had stories where the Justice League are trying to live in a world where they have to adapt to not having Superman there to help them. Or when Batman got his back broken, the rest of the characters didn't have Batman to rely on. And not only that, you had this other new psychotic Batman running around that was a problem for other characters in the universe. So when something happened in a book, it had stakes and it mattered, and you could feel that. Even if you didn't read that comic, you would see the fallout in other books of them having to deal with what was going on in the one continuous DC universe. And then if you had a writer who wanted to stretch their creative legs and do something new with a character or introduce a new concept, you had the Elseworlds label, which, yeah, it may have been a bit clunky because it was just, you would write these stories and they would slap this label on it, and that would indicate that it's not within the whole of the DC universe. But ultimately, DC Comics had some of their best stories come out of the Elseworlds label. And some of them, if they were popular enough, modern writers would find a way to maybe integrate some of these concepts into the actual DC whole of Earth Prime and make them part of the universe and part of the canon, similar to the way Marvel handled their What If storylines. But unfortunately, with some of the marketing that we have coming up on this dawn of the DCU, it looks like they're going to be bringing this clunky cheat code of a storytelling device with them. And you know what? I'm just going to call it like it is. The multiverse at this point, it's just lazy writing. It's writers that don't want to be hindered to a continuity. They don't want to be hindered to history. They want this endless string of do-overs, and the multiverse just gives them that. And it's time we be done with this. It really is. This concept doesn't do DC Comics any favors as much as they think it does. And you might have a good writer who will come along and give you a good multiverse story and a good way to integrate the multiverse into the universe. But just like when they did it originally, that storytelling device gets used so many times and abused that eventually just becomes the anchor that holds DC Comics from going forward and will eventually sink it into the dark and murky abyss, which is what's happened now and is what happened with every reboot that's happened since. That's what sunk that continuity or the era of DC Comics after Crisis on Infinite Earths. It was clicking along perfectly fine. And then all of a sudden we have the Dark Crisis comes along and reintroduces the multiverse. Jeff Johns brought it back, and then things just slowly descended, and then we get the New 52 and modern DC. And there it is. The multiverse is always the genesis of the end of DC Comics. Every time they start introducing it, it gets used, it gets abused, and it leads to the end. That's the pattern of DC Comics, and I see no indication that this new reboot is going to do anything but that. So the only solution for DC Comics, ditch these alternate Earths. You have one Earth, Earth Prime, and go with that. But that's my opinion. And I'd really like to know yours. Do you guys think it's right? Do you agree with me or disagree with me? I'm sure there's some of you that disagree with me, and I'd really like to hear why you think that DC Comics should keep this narrative device as a pivotal part, a pillar of their universe. Let's talk about it in the comments below. While you're down there, do all the usual stuff. Hit like and subscribe, and I will talk to you on the next video. See you then. Bye.